want to welcome you back to our walk through Romans. We are walking through Romans. We're not running through it. We're not hurrying through it. We are taking a nice leisurely stroll through the book of Romans. We're looking at it verse by verse. And actually this week, we're going to look at it word by word in some of the areas. In what we're going to look at this week, we're going to look at 21 words that Paul used to describe a society and a generation. Today we're in Romans, the first chapter, verse number 28. Now, verse number 28 starts with this word "and." That means this is a continuation of what the Apostle Paul was talking about in verse number 27. Well, in verse number 27, the Apostle Paul reveals to us how homosexuality came into a society. You know, the Roman Empire was very, very gay. Not gay as far as happy, but very homosexual. In fact, many people believe that Nero himself was a homosexual person. Okay? And so Paul has taken us through a stroll, or taking us through a walk in the way that a place falls apart. A society falls apart. And so he left us in verse number 27 talking about homosexuality and saying that they will have in their own bodies the penalty for their error. And then he goes on in verse 28 and he says, "And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer." What's this mean? Did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer. Well, if you were to go into the Greek language, these words "did not see fit to acknowledge," that's actually one word in the Greek language. And it means to test something, but not only to test something, but to approve of that thing that is tested. You know, if you buy a can of anything anymore, and you look on the side, you would see that this has been approved by the Federal Drug Administration or whatever. It's been approved. It's been tested. You buy any kind of products and they've been tested and approved. Well, that's exactly what the Apostle Paul is talking about. God has been tested, and because he is God, everything is fit. Everything is approved of. You know, God doesn't make mistakes. He knows everything. He sees everything. God doesn't make mistakes. And so what the Apostle Paul is saying here is, just as they did not see fit, in other words, they did not test and come to the decision that God is approved of, that what he says is right. You see, we need to understand that our lives, not only our lives, but our nations and our families, our societies, you know what? They are all based upon this one thing. What do you think about God? Do you acknowledge him in your own personal life? I think any believer has come to this point where they've said, you know what, I am not right about the sin that I'm living in. And I acknowledge that Jesus died for my sins. What are they doing? They are acknowledging that God is right. But in our nations and in our societies, if we're going to end the downward spiral that the Apostle Paul is showing us here, the way that we end it is by people coming and saying God is fit. He is approved of. What he says is true. And if we continue to spiral downward morally in our nations and in the world that we live in, you know what's going to happen? We're going to continue to receive destruction. I hope that you understand that. I am not a naysayer, but you know what? We need to be real. We need to understand that if we don't begin to acknowledge God. That when God says something is sin, that it is sin and it's not meant for our society. If we don't do that, you know what? We are going to continue to spiral downward. Now let's go back to that verse number 28. God gave them over to a depraved mind. Now again, we see these words, God gave them over. Actually, in the Greek language, it says this, God surrendered them over. He surrendered them. You see, God doesn't want robots. He doesn't want people that just serve him because he's God. He wants people to serve him because they know that he is right, that his knowledge, his wisdom is what they need. And so God just basically says to this society, to this group of people, you know what? If that's what you want, that's what you get. But now the Apostle Paul is going to warn us about what happens. You see, God gave them over to what? To a depraved mind. What does the word depraved mean? It means a mind that's worthless. It means a mind that's empty. It means a mind that cannot retain understanding. You ever look at something, read something in the paper or hear it on the news and you say, what were they thinking? Well, their problem started with who they think God is. What were they thinking to kill those people? What were they thinking to rob that store? What were they thinking? Well, it all started with the problem in morality. And morality needs to be based on what God says and not on what society says. What does God say? And so God gives people over. He surrenders them over to what they want. They want a mind that's worthless, a mind that doesn't think. And then he goes on in verse number 28, and he says, to do the things which are not proper. What is the progression here? First of all, they say, you know what? We're not going to acknowledge God. We're not going to approve of what he says. Then our minds are going to become worthless. And then they begin to do the things that are not proper. Actions will follow your view of God. So I pray and I hope that you are sitting down with the Word of God and saying, God, show me who you are. I hope that you've enjoyed this today, even though it's probably hard for some of you to listen to. It's the truth. Listen to it. Join us again tomorrow as we continue this walk through the book of Romans.